Welcome to GDS 076 Module 2, Interaction Design, Definitions and Foundations. In this module, we're going to take a look at a definition for and gain a personal understanding for what is interaction design. We'll talk about good and bad design on a higher level. And as we progress through the semester, we'll look at examples of good and bad design based primarily on some of the principles of interaction design that we talk about in this module, as well as some of the principles developed by Don Norman. Interaction designers are faced with a dilemma. Whether you're redesigning a product or you're designing a product from the ground up, the question is always, what's the best way for the user to interact with the product? And I like this example of interacting with the smart TV from the reading because it resonates with me because I have Xfinity, and when I access the web apps like Netflix or Amazon, it becomes really annoying. So what's the best way to interact with a smart TV? I prefer using voice control with the remote if it recognizes my voice, which has a tendency not to do that, and I have to query the system at least 3 or 4 times before it actually recognizes what I'm saying. But the most annoying aspect is pecking around with the remote control or some other grid keyboard that is displayed on the screen. When we ask ourselves, what should we design? We need to consider some fundamental things. Who are the users? What are they doing? That's what you'll hear me refer to as context. Context is king. Where are they doing it? That's part of the context. And the why they are doing it is part of the context and the user goals, which is very important in terms of motive matching in the application, meeting the needs of the user and their motives, as well as the user having a motivational and meaningful experience from the application or technology. So let's take a look at bad design. Many of you have taken my classes in the past know that I'm obsessed with auto checkout. And I recently had an encounter with another kiosk that is actually very simple and binary in terms of the choice that the user has to make, but it is quite a bad experience. But for now, let's take a look at this interesting video on this door on the 10th floor, and some discussion about the actual design of doors. You can find the link in Canvas. So just pop open this video. I've also provided the link in YouTube. And so open it up, take a look at it, then come back to this video and continue. So what'd you think about that video? I mean, doors fundamentally show us the idea of an affordance and how user interfaces speak to us in words or verbs that imply action or or prompt the user to do something. And so there are some really good examples of bad door design, and that might perplex you, particularly in hotels. But what is good design? A lot of both of these questions, should I say, are really from the eye of the beholder, right? But most importantly, from the eye of the user, because ultimately we're responsible to the user. And so we want them to perceive that our technology is a good design because they have that meaningful, pleasurable experience that using the technology while achieving their goals. And I think that if you were to ask most people about a product that was well designed, particularly in the early 2000s, they would have probably said the iPhone. In fact, having a good experience in terms of the design was the major priority for Steve Jobs. So let's take a look at interaction design and some of the definitions. The term interaction design kind of emerged in the late 70s when Bill Moggridge designed the first laptop. And he is also the co-founder of IDEO. And Bill Verplanck from Stanford University was also credited with promoting the term interaction design. Here's some common and popular definitions. We're going to take a look at two. Um, Interaction design, according to the Interaction Design Foundation, is the design of interactive products and services in which a designer's focus goes beyond the item in development to include the way users interact with it. Well, that's very important because, as I said before, and you'll hear me say over and over, context and user context and goals are king. And it should drive primarily all of our decisions. So, close scrutiny of user needs, limitations, and context, etc., empowers us to customize and develop an application or technology to meet the precise, or I would also say very broad demands of one or more users. According to Wikipedia, interaction design is the practice of designing interactive digital products, environment systems, and services. As most of our digital products are an extension of services that are offered on a more broader level, like in the realm of e-commerce or some other form of commerce. Beyond the digital aspect, interaction design is also useful when creating physical non-digital products, which is very true. So sometimes when we think interaction design, we're thinking of something like, again, the smartphone, but it can also extend beyond that, like smart appliances. I mean, we recently got a new coffee maker, and there is a lot of good interaction design built into it, and it's a non digital product. Common topics of interaction design include design as a whole, human computer interaction, and software development. But Wikipedia says finally that interaction design is focused on meeting the needs and optimizing the experience of users with relevant technical or business constraints. And I forgot my period there. So I studied engineering, not typing. But yeah, that makes sense. But you know, I want something more concise that I can conceptualize for myself. I like this definition from the Interaction Design Association. Interaction design defines the structure and behavior of interactive systems. Let's talk about that. The structure and behavior of interactive systems. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in the presentation. But that the actual structure, which is the information architecture, the hierarchy of the information that's presented, particularly in digital products on the screen, is an amalgamation of the hierarchy and structure and then the behavior, which overtly queries the user to interact with the application or technology. So interaction designers strive to create meaningful relationships between people and products and services that they use, from computers to mobile devices and appliances and beyond. Our practices are evolving with the world. I like this definition because it's broad enough that it applies to interaction design and user experience design in the 21st century. And it also emphasizes and makes a really good point of saying that our job is really about meaningful relationships between people and technology. And that means that we have to strive for some kind of ubiquitous, transparent experience. In other words, when you utilize something, like this little Fitbit, for example, if it doesn't get in the way and it provides you with a meaningful experience and the ability to accomplish your goals, like it doesn't become an impediment, it's simple and efficient to use, then that technology becomes ubiquitous and transparent. A good example of transparency of all things is a plain old pencil. Most of us have used a pencil at some point in our life, and it's to the point where some people don't even consider a pencil to be technology. But imagine when the lead pencil, was introduced and how people may have perceived it. So we looked at those definitions, and I really want you to kind of internalize it for yourself because I think it's important that you understand and have a perspective of interaction design, but also so that you can articulate your perspective to others. Interaction design is probably the most multifaceted part of user experience design, and it is composed of academic disciplines and design practices from everything from ergonomics to cognitive psychology, computer science, sociology, and graphic design, product design, and industrial design. In fact, interaction design was born out of industrial design. I like this diagram called the interaction design pillars because it shows us kind of where those different domains intersect within interaction design and fit within the overall realm of user experience design. In GDS 70, we examine some of these concepts and definitions and how they fit within user experience design. And I think, of course, that user experience design is the overarching pillar, if you will, because it's the front line experience that it drives the frontline experience that users have. And the interaction design is sort of a subset, but that makes it no less important. In fact, it's even more important primarily because interaction design overlaps human factors and human computer interaction or interface design so much, whereas other factors or pillars like information architecture really are more in the semantic side and structure side. So really, if you understanding definitions is very helpful, but the way I look at this and summarize the goals of interaction design and sort of implies a definition is that is that interaction designers develop usable products, whether they be digital or non-digital. And usability means that they're easy to learn, they're effective to use, they help the user solve a problem, and they provide an enjoyable experience. Those three things are very important. But also, as we develop usable products, we also have to constantly involve users and stakeholders in the design process so that we make sure that we're meeting the goals of our stakeholders and the users and developing usable products within the proper context that they need to be used. In fact, interaction design is really a balance between usability and user experience. Also inherent in interaction design is the pleasurable experience and the idea of flow. The concept of flow is that if people feel that they are working with an application or for a good example games, If the users feel that if the users have a low skill level, but have to interact with a complex application, then they have anxiety. And this speaks to usability, right? So if a user is particularly has low efficacy, or let's say proficiency in technology, and then they have a very complex application, where they can't form a mental model for how it works or fits in their goals, then they'll probably get anxious or give up on the application. And in the converse, if an application is not contextually correct, and a user's very proficient, if you will, with technology, or how they want to accomplish the goal or achieve their goal, they might be bored. The idea of flow is that you have this nice fit where a user feels that basically an application fits their needs, and it's transparent. And so it's kind of like being in a state of euphoria, right? Where you have this cycle where you have increasing challenges that require increasing skills, and then you, as you increase your skills, the challenge decreases and it becomes less demanding. And this primarily applies to designing games, but you can also see it in the design of things like um, music players, for example, in that you want them to be easy for the user to conceptualize and to interact with, so they get immediate gratification. Another example of the importance of flow would be using that TV remote. The idea of flow was a big consideration, as I mentioned earlier, for the design of the first iPhone. In fact, what I'd like you to do is take a look at this video on the iPhone interaction design. And one of the things that Steve Jobs felt was important in his keynote when they introduced the iPhone, and this idea of flow, and why it was important and how it influenced them in designing the iPhone. All right, so we're almost done. Let's talk about some principles of interaction design that you would encounter in the reading and that will reinforce through the semester. You know, interaction design has 5 dimensions. The first dimension is words, which actually form the interactions and controls, including what we see verbally on the screen. These elements in this first dimension are referred to as words because they literally speak to us and they call us to action. Visual representations are supplemental to the words, and they include things like type, diagrams, icons, and other graphics to help the user to identify the parts of an interface and the elements of the interaction. And then the physical objects, which are also part of the interaction, like, for example, hardware, whether such as a mouse or a laptop or a smartwatch, or in the case of a smart appliance, something like digital television or smart TV. Time is also an important dimension of interaction because we're sort of wired to observe and use change over time as a cue for or an indicator that we have achieved some form of goal or success. And that can be as simple as changes in sound, such as oral responses, like in a voice user interface, a video, or what's used a lot in applications is animation. And then the behavior The fifth dimension includes the interactivity and the action or emotion, operation or an emotion, user emotions. And so that behavior is wired in to control all of the previous four dimensions, such that the user perceives interactivity, action, ease of use, and a satisfying experience. Don Norman introduced his principles of interaction design, as you saw in the video, when he first wrote um, his book on the design of everyday things. And he said that interaction design and interfaces involve affordances, which refers to an attribute of an object that allows people to know how to use it. An affordance basically is basically saying, "Hey, here I am. You can use me to do something," and it's obvious. Visibility is important part of the principles of interaction, according to Don Norman, and that he says that the more visible an element is, the more likely users will know about them and how to use them. And that speaks to this whole idea of proximity that you learn in some of your design classes and the design of design principles, or the CARP or CRAP principle. Feedback, making it clear to the user what action has been taken. So it's really important. Interaction is like a two-way conversation between people. You know, you say something and the person responds, and you perceive that as feedback. Constraints limit the range of interaction possibilities for the user, to simplify the interface and to guide the user to the appropriate action. So a good example of a constraint, and that you see a lot, and it sometimes can become annoyance, is a modal window, right? A modal window might pop open for you to confirm that, provide you with a message, and then for you to confirm that you have received that message, right? And another example of a constraint is when you first access some software, you're given a tour of the software. And so those constraints limit the range of interaction possibilities. And constraints are also important to managing cognitive load, which we'll talk about later in the course. Mapping shows clear relationships between the controls and the effect that they have. That's really important. In fact, for the lab, you will have to redesign a web page, and I know this will probably be one of the few times that we focus on like a web page, but a ERP system and how it has poor mapping, and it confuses users and guides them down the wrong path. Consistency involves having similar operations and similar elements for achieving similar tasks. That's an idea of repetition, right? Because again, people will formulate an idea or model for how a technology works, and you want to have that consistency. All of the things that we've discussed prior to in the previous slides, in the principles of interaction design, as well as the five dimensions, and there's two articles that I want you to read about that, on a larger scale, folds back into and leads to the overall user experience. But they have their place within the hierarchy of developing the user experience. If you've taken GDS 70, you'll know that one of the descriptions that I like in conceptualizations of web applications is by Jesse James Garrett and the elements of user experience. And that what Garrett says is that what we perceive on the sensory level, the actual surface, which is the web page or the mobile app or the interface on another technology, is an amalgamation of all of those tasks and principles that are addressed at each level, from the strategy plane all the way to the surface. And we see that interaction design sits right about the middle where structure is defined, and it's almost adjacent to and part of the and relies on, should I say, the development of the information architecture, because the information architecture and the structure will imply the different interactions that we include in an application. And then those things bubble up to the interface design, navigation, and all the way up to the user's experience at the sensory surface level. So that's a lot of stuff, right? And in chapter one, you get a quick introduction. We'll reinforce it and we'll look at some of these principles in a more usable fashion as we proceed through the course. And we're going to use a design model to do that. And we'll talk next week about design models and why they're important to user experience design and interaction design, but not as much as we do in 70. So it'll be kind of GDS 70. It'll be kind of a review. But what we'll be doing in this class is we'll use a modified sprint with some of the labs. And in fact, you will do this. So I recommend that I give you a challenge, or for even some of your own design projects, that you ideate and map. Well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, you're going to look at the goal and the user's goals and your stakeholders' goals, and you're going to come up with ideas and then map those ideas out against the prototypical user and the user's needs. What does that look like? What is the hierarchy of the information architecture that we need to include? And then from there, that pushes us up the plane, if we will, in the elements of user experience. And now it's time for us to sketch an interface with the interactions and controls that meet the context and the goals and of the mapping that we done previously. And if you're working with a team, getting a consensus, and then from that point, prototyping and iterating between prototyping, testing, and learning until you have a minimum viable product. So what are the next steps? I know this has been a long presentation. Well, complete lab number one, fixing bad user experiences. And that exercise, I want you to pick the level of fidelity that you want to include in the final product that you deliver to me. So I know some of you may not have taken GDS 70 or 72, and so you may not have used Adobe XD or Balsamic or Figma or some other prototyping tool. At a minimum, I would like to see a sketch with some kind of flow that shows how you would redesign the process. And then you're also required to post to the discussion of an example of good and bad design. And you can pick one or the other, just something simple. It can be an app or some other technology that you use that's non-digital or hybrid. And I want you to post your example and then reply to a peer. If you have any questions, post your questions on the questions forum.